Welcome to How Is This Legal? Where in each episode we crack open the books to find outlandish legislation and regulations that make you ask, how is this legal? If you like what you hear, please be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with your family and friends. Here to break down what these laws mean to you is your host, Kyle Lorraine.
And here we go. Today I am joined by Mr. Tom Slayton. He's one of my classmates. Tom is a ferocious writer and researcher. He just got done writing a commentary last year for the Journal of Legal Medicine, which will be published in the spring edition of the Journal of Legal Medicine here in a couple months. The title is called Ransomware, the Virus Destroying the Healthcare Industry. And Tom is here today to talk a little bit about what ransomware is. How you doing, Tom?
Doing good, Kyle. I appreciate you having me on.
That's no problem. So just to give the listeners kind of an idea of what we'll be talking about today, could you describe what ransomware is?
Yeah, sure. So ransomware is it's basically a computer virus. But the interesting thing about ransomware is that when it encrypts your files or when it locks you out of your computer, it allows you to have access back to them, but only after paying the ransom, hence the name ransomware.
Can you move the mic a little closer to your face, please?
Yeah, how does that work?
Yeah.
I apologize to the listeners. This is my first time on a podcast.
Oh, that's no big deal. You just got to be real close, otherwise it doesn't sound like anything.
Understandable. So ransomware, there's two major forms of ransomware, although there are other versions of the virus, but there's two that are most common, and that's crypto ransomware and locker ransomware. Crypto ransomware encrypts a user's files and data and blocks the user's access until the ransom's been paid. And locker ransomware basically creates a digital locker around those files. So it doesn't do anything to the files themselves, but it still blocks access until the ransom's been paid.
So what kind of people are using these things, or what are they trying to get when they're using this? They're just trying to get money, or do they want to get other information, or what's the most typical application?
I mean, money's definitely the most typical, especially when people actually pay the fine. But the real concern is when they access the underlying data and then sell it on the dark web. So specifically, my topic was ransomware in the healthcare industry. And the information that you can get off of a healthcare provider is social security number, insurance policy number, et cetera, et cetera. And if that's sold on the dark web or the black market, that allows people to create fake medical claims, stolen identity. Identity fraud is a huge problem, in large part because of ransomware today. So that's generally the main thrust. But then there is a significant amount of money to be made just on getting the ransom back. There's still a huge debate on how much of this data is used other than being held for ransom. But either way, whether the hackers sell it or whether they just collect a ransom, the main thing they're trying to get here is money.
Is there what's the most, from what you came across, the most money somebody's gotten from one of these attacks?
Oh, it's large. So there was an attack, I want to say it was in 2014. It was either Crypto Locker or Reviton. I think it was Crypto Locker. And the hackers made $30 million within the first 3 months. And the crazy thing about that is conservative estimates predict that only about 0.4% of all people affected actually paid the ransom. So they made $30 million off of, a fraction of a percent of the people they actually targeted. And those are conservative estimates. It's much more likely that the percentage of people who paid the ransom is multiple times that, and they probably made even more than $30 million. But as we'll get to eventually in the breadth of the topic, is that most companies and most people don't report these crimes. They don't report that they've been the victim of a ransomware attack. And so it makes it really, really hard to figure out exactly how much money these hackers are making and exactly how much information is out there on the dark web.
So if there's only a small percentage of people that are paying up on these attacks, is it a lot of bluffing? Are the hackers saying they're going to do X and they don't actually have any sort of incriminating information or anything that they're going to use against the person that they're attacking?
Yeah, so it's actually not about incriminating information at all, at least obviously there are examples of ransomware that purports to have incriminating information, like the Reviton virus in 2012, in which you'd basically receive a message that the FBI had caught you downloading child pornography or downloading illegal music, pirating music, whatever it was, and they would say, "Hey, if you want access to your files again, if you want to make this all go away, pay a couple $100." But in most cases, there's nothing incriminating that the hackers are alleging to have. They're merely saying, "We've locked all of your information, and if you want it back, you have to pay a ransom." And in some cases, if you're tech savvy, you can probably get away around this ransomware without ever paying the money or ever replacing your computer. I would assume some people bring their computer into a tech store and they'll do a hard reboot. Not all of these viruses are incredibly sophisticated, and I think a fair majority of them you can get around yourself if you know what you're doing. The problem is the more sophisticated attacks, the ones that occur against hospitals, the ones that occur against healthcare providers, where they're not just targeting the general public, they're targeting large corporations, with really, really sophisticated attacks. I mean, you hear about the WannaCry ransomware that everyone's pointing at North Korea for doing, and that nearly devastated. It didn't really affect the United States that much, but it nearly devastated like 90 something countries back in, this would have been about a year ago. So the attacks vary in how effective they are, in how damaging they are, and in what kind of information that they're alleging to have. But for the most part, ransomware merely means that they've locked your files. You can't access them until you either get around it or you pay the ransom, or just get a new computer, which does happen in some cases.
It's funny that you mentioned the FBI one. My girlfriend recently bought a Windows computer, and we typically have had Macs, and they have less problems with viruses. They still happen, just not quite as often. And she was trying to download, I think it was like Adobe Reader or something like pretty common. And one of those things about the FBI, like watching your computer, popped up. And she came out and she's like, "Oh my God, what's happening?" I'm like, first of all, if the FBI was tracking your computer, there's no way they're going to send you a message and say, "We're locking your computer down and you can't do anything." So I think a lot of people responding to that, or like having the fear that that's a legitimate claim, sort of highlights how little a lot of people know about the way that law enforcement functions and some of the things they have to go through in terms of, getting a warrant, and just kind of common sense too. Like, obviously, if they're coming after you, they're not going to send you a message beforehand.
Oh, absolutely. And I'll admit it. I think the statute of limitations has run. I pirated music in my early days.
Who didn't?
Exactly. And I probably would have believed it. I don't know. Maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't have. But if I got a message from the FBI saying, "Hey, we know what you're doing, pay X amount of money or else we're gonna come after you," there's a chance that I might have paid it if I thought it was legitimate. But we're also, so what's interesting about us is we grew up in a time where we had computers from a young age, even more so now, the kids growing up. But if you think of someone 40, 50, 60 years old, they don't necessarily, and this, obviously it varies, but a good portion of them didn't grow up learning how to operate a computer, knowing which links you can click. I know I've been forwarded some suspicious emails from aunts, uncles, grandparents, whatever it may be, because there's some, forward this to 1,000 people and you win a prize or whatever it is. So I think part of it's just user awareness, but also we have the advantage of already being aware of a lot of the stuff that's out there, whereas some people who didn't have that advantage growing up with computers are learning anew, and there's a learning curve to it.
I imagine they're only going to have to get more sophisticated as time goes on too. Because even when we were kids, I remember I had like LimeWire or whatever, and I remember downloading a song one time, and there was that. I think everybody downloaded this at one point, and it would say like, "Stop what you're doing. You're downloading music illegally." I don't know if you remember getting a message that was similar to that when you tried to play the song. And I remember for a split second thinking like the cops are going to bust down the door and I'm going to prison. And there was always like that hysteria about like it was $100,000 a song or whatever, like the rumor was with you and your friends.
That's actually what scared me the most, because it was kind of a game between us on who had the largest music library, and we were never going to listen to all this music, but we had thousands of songs, and it was always terrifying because you'd hear stories, yeah, like $30,000 a song or whatever it was, and I think there was actually a few examples of the government really charging someone with this and really levying these huge fines. I don't know whatever happened to them. I know after a while they started going after the people who were uploading them rather than downloading them.
which would make more sense.
Oh, absolutely, and that's what they should have been doing all along. And granted, I haven't tried to pirate anything in a long time, but I assume it's much more difficult now. I assume you have to be even more tech savvy, have a VPN, the whole nine yards. The last time I pirated something was probably in college, and I think it was a Game of Thrones episode. And it wasn't a couple of weeks after that I got a legitimate email from HBO saying, "Hey, if you keep doing this, we're going to come after you." And that scared the crap out of me. At least I think it was a legitimate email, and I had friends that got similar emails. But yeah, that scared me away from it.
Yeah, and then, but I can't help but think that, like, my nephew is 2 years old, and I called my brother earlier, and I get a message back that says I'm on my way, and I was like, "What are you talking about?" And then he called me back. He's like, "Sorry, Zachary was watching a video on my phone, and he, like, whenever someone calls, he knows to hit like the red button to hang up, and then I guess he hit like respond with a message right away because he's always watching YouTube videos." So kids growing up in that generation that are constantly like, there's times he'll be watching stuff on YouTube that's like in Chinese or whatever, because I mean he doesn't know, he just clicks around. But like, as comfortable as they are with technology and always having a screen in front of them, I can't help but think it's going to be much harder to fool them than it was to fool us even. And we had the benefit of having high speed internet at, like, I don't know, like, I think we were 9 or 10 whenever my folks got it at their house. So it seems like the hackers do have some work to do to sort of keep this ruse going.
Oh, absolutely. But I mean, they're becoming far more sophisticated. So in part of my paper, I talk about it was right around 2008. Hackers started using fake antivirus software as a means to get access to people's information. They'd send an email saying, "Hey, you need this," or a pop up saying, "Hey, you need this antivirus software."
It's such a good idea.
Oh, it's genius. And people would click on the links, and they think that they're protecting themselves, but no, they're giving access to hackers, and they're allowing them basically into their system. But eventually, people became more aware, and so hackers had to adapt. They had to overcome. What I find most interesting about nowadays, at least in my research, is ransomware attacks. And maybe this is because there's more money in it this way. Maybe it's because user awareness has grown to such an extent that they needed to adapt. But from what I can tell, most hackers target corporations now. They target companies. They don't necessarily target single users. Or if they are targeting single users, they're targeting single users who they're hoping to be hooked up to a network, something that it's more than just one single person trying to get a couple $100. It seems now that it's, let's hold this hospital hostage for $50,000 in Bitcoin. By the way, Bitcoin is how these people all operate. Bitcoin and payment vouchers, which payment vouchers aren't really a thing anymore, but Bitcoin is huge. That's how these people get paid, because it is untraceable. And that's actually why I think, I don't want to get into the whole Bitcoin discussion, but I do think that it will continue to grow to an extent, because it is, ransomware will continue to grow. Hacking will continue to grow. So as long as this is the most viable currency for this industry, I think it's going to remain steady. In 2020, this is supposed to be a $20 billion year industry, just ransomware alone, not even including all the other hacking. And so if this is the major currency, then I think it's going to, but that's beside the point. I don't know enough about Bitcoin to get into it.
It's such a pain in the ass too, because like, if you're a corporation, you probably don't own Bitcoin. So if you're trying to make this go away, if you were a hospital and they're threatening to release people's information, or whatever, shut down your servers, then you have to go out and buy some Bitcoin and then transfer it to them. So it adds even another step for the average person, which is just so insulting, because you're doing it so they won't get caught.
Oh, absolutely. I like to imagine it as some young intern who gets yelled at and go find us $15,000 in Bitcoin, figure out how to buy it so we can pay off these hackers. I'm sure it's much more complex than that. I actually, it wasn't Bitcoin, but I thought about buying some of the other cryptocurrencies, and I looked into it, and it's a few day process. I mean, you have to give all your bank information, then you have to wait for it to clear, and yada yada yada. It's not an immediate thing. You don't just go on a market and say, "Hey, give me this Bitcoin," and they'll give you the Bitcoin. There's a process to it. And again, I don't know too much about Bitcoin, so I don't want to get into it, but I always did find that funny that, a bunch of execs in a corner office are trying to figure out what the hell Bitcoin is and where they can find it to get their systems back online.
Yeah, that is a pretty comical thing to think about. I do know you can buy it on that Square Cash app. Joe Rogan has been advertising for them quite a bit lately, and he was talking about you can go on there and sign up, and you'll get like $5 free or whatever, and then you can buy Bitcoin in the app, which I thought was kind of cool. It's like more of an access to it if it's something that people do want to see grow. So as far as your commentary, just kind of digging in a little bit more, what were some of the major uh, threats to the healthcare industry that you uncovered while doing this research?
Yeah, so it kind of surprised me at first. I didn't really think this was a healthcare issue, but it is more so than any other industry. Hackers are targeting the healthcare industry using ransomware. And so after or doing some research, I realized that well, part of it is because of this. It's called the Health Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health. It's called high tech, and it passed in 2009. And prior to 2008, about 10% of hospitals had basic electronic health record systems. By 2014, that number was over 75%. So there's a couple of theories. A lot of people guessed that maybe hackers had stayed away from the healthcare industry because they realized that patients relied on these systems for vital need. They were worried that if I hack into this system and I shut them down, is someone going to die as a result of my actions? And I think that's giving a little too much credit to hackers because I don't think most of them care. I think the reason that healthcare industry is being targeted now is because so much of this information is available through their electronic records. 75% of hospitals or healthcare providers, all of their information. It's probably even more so. That was 2014, so I'm sure it's even more so now. But have their information readily available on their system drives or whatever it is. Um, and so, excuse me. So I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question? I got a little off track.
Oh, it's no big deal. So I was just more generally just getting us to the topic of what some of the biggest threats were to the healthcare industry with this ransomware. But the records thing that you mentioned, that they're all electronically stored, is unsurprising, but it's also problematic too. I know you and I were talking off air a couple weeks ago now, I guess, about the commentary I'm writing, which is about the human augmentation, and we were talking about how people are getting pacemakers hacked and held for ransom, and how really the only way to stop that would be to make sure that the records aren't stored anywhere electronically. Like everything would have to be handwritten. If, for example, they needed a serial number or a record of who even had one of these, it would all have to be paper records, which just seems so archaic. But it's crazy that there's really nothing that can't be accessed by somebody with enough know-how and maliciousness.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, and it's a huge problem. And so the High Tech Act, I mean, it was a great thing. We need to have our information stored, maybe not online, but we need it stored electronically somewhere. We can't go back to handwritten notes for everything. It's just not plausible. It doesn't make any sense. We're moving along technologically, why not have everything move along with it? But there is this major concern, and especially when you talk about pacemakers, and I briefly mentioned it in my commentary that there haven't been any reported attacks, but it is a legitimate concern. And especially, I think in your commentary, you talk about who was that? Was that Dick Cheney?
Yeah, whenever he was vice president, it was either the Secret Service or someone advised that he have his pacemaker's wireless capabilities disabled. That way, because they use the wireless capability for doctors to be able to communicate with these devices to make sure they're functioning properly. But the Secret Service advised that he have that part disabled while he was vice president for fear of an attack like this.
Yeah, so that's my major concern with that is either A, it's going to be a national security issue, or B, hackers will target people in positions of power or people who have a lot of money. Imagine Bill Gates had a pacemaker, and it was common knowledge they had a pacemaker. If these are easily hackable, how easy would it be for someone to hack it and say, Bill Gates, you're worth $100 billion or whatever it is. Send me 50 million and I won't kill you. When it comes to the average person, the average Joe Schmo, I don't know how much money hackers are going to make on that, especially for the time requirement. And then also you got to think about the legal aspects of it. There you're getting much more. What hackers are doing for ransomware is entirely illegal. They can be prosecuted under a number of laws, but it's also, it's. Uh, I guess it's just I don't know how to quite say this, but it's easier to go after someone much more harshly if they are threatening someone's life directly with the hacking.
Oh
You
yeah.
have more public support behind it. It makes the news quicker. You put more resources into it. Once you start directly threatening people's lives, then I think you're going to have a huge outcry, and then I think the problem gets taken care of a little bit easier. And I think right now hackers are fine to just attack healthcare providers and hospitals and kind of lay below the radar while still making a ton of money. But eventually there is going to be this giant question we have to ask ourselves about what we're going to do with pacemakers and the like, and how we're going to stop them from being penetrated by a hacker or some sort of cyber attack.
Yeah, and you could almost make the argument that that's kind of how society feels about corporations and hospitals, especially because they always feel like they're getting fucked over whenever they go and get an ambulance ride and they have to pay, $5,000 or whatever it is. I read something earlier today where there was a kid in rural Missouri that had to do a helicopter ride to the hospital, and his bill was like $32,000 that his parents had to pay. Even after the insurance had paid their portion, they only paid like $8,000 of it or something crazy like that. So if you have a system where it's a bunch of corporations and hospitals that a lot of people don't necessarily look at in the best light anyway, that are the subject of these attacks, you're not going to have much of an outcry, like you were saying, for change, and the system can kind of keep going. And I almost wonder if the hackers are sort of relying on that, if they know if they're going after, evil corporation A or whatever, that most people probably won't care. They'll be like, oh, they're a corporation, they have plenty of money, what does it matter?
Yeah, certainly to an extent, it's not people think it's not an attack on me, and they're wrong in that, because any of these attacks, they're the healthcare providers paying the sum, sure, but it's your information that's getting leaked out there on the dark web. But you're absolutely right that it is easier to target these companies, and there's less of a public outcry. But the fact that there's less of a public outcry is actually one of the main topics of my commentary, and there's less of a public outcry because these healthcare providers the law doesn't require them to report most breaches. And so a lot of the times when these happen, you have no way of knowing that your information's been stolen, been manipulated, been accessed, been whatever it was. And the few examples I provide in my commentary were hospitals, one in DC and a healthcare group out of no, a healthcare group out of DC and a hospital in California. And the reason those were so well known is because it shut the hospital down. It's very hard to keep something like that out of the public eye. But for other corporations, for other companies that just have their information stolen, um, they generally just have to look at their state's data breach laws, which 47 states currently have data breach laws. The three, I can't remember all of them that don't, but Alabama's up there and one of the Dakotas. Um, but the data breach laws are incredibly subjective, and that was the biggest problem I found with ransomware is that of the 47 states with data breach notification laws, 36 require a reasonable risk of harm before a notification is triggered, which basically means that they have to reasonably believe that the hackers accessed information that will harm the consumers. Now, the problem with that is that it's subjective enough that companies can claim, even though they experienced a breach, the data was only locked, not compromised. So, especially in locker ransomware attacks, when, like I said, or maybe I didn't say this, but locker ransomware attacks basically just create a digital locker around the system. And so there's an argument to be made that none of those files were actually touched. They were just placed in a locker, and once we paid the money, we got them back. And so why do we need to tell our consumers about that? And technically they're correct. According to the law, they don't. And I think you can have an argument that they do, but for most of them, they're correct that they don't. Now, there are a few states that have recognized that this is a problem, and California is the one that I used in my example. And Kamala Harris, who's now a senator, was the Attorney General of California for a number of years, and she, fighting cyber crimes was one of her biggest mandates. And so what they did is they recently changed it that you have to disclose a breach when a company reasonably believes that personal information, excuse me, sorry. So
No big deal.
you have to disclose a breach when a company reasonably believes that personal information has been acquired or manipulated in any way. And the thing that this law does is it presumes harm when a breach occurs, unlike the other 36 states where you don't presume harm when a breach occurs. Basically, there has to be more than just a breach before you have to notify consumers. And I think that's a big problem, because even if your information hasn't been accessed or manipulated, the mere fact that a healthcare provider or any corporation experiences a breach should be a big deal to the people who trust that company with their information. And the only way we can get companies to step up their security, to be more careful with our information, is if there's some sort of public outcry. But if the public never hears about it, there can never be a public outcry. And so that was my big problem is, I do think that the public in general will be concerned with the amount of information being accessed by hackers, but until companies are forced to disclose that they've been breached, you just don't have that public outcry. I mean, you look at Yahoo, and I don't have the exact details, but Yahoo was attacked in like 2014 or something, and it's like 2 years later before they finally admitted they had a breach, and then it was another 12 months after that before they revealed how in depth it was, and it was this crazy number. 3 billion people, 3 billion accounts were affected by the attack. And I'm guessing most people still have no idea, even though they did report it. But that scares me, and that's just the information you have on Yahoo, which is, nothing compared to.
Very minimal.
Yeah, especially compared to the information you fill out a form at a hospital, and that immediately goes into their systems, and that's everything. That's your entire life story right there. There's very few places you give more personal information than in a hospital. And so that's why I focused on hospitals, healthcare providers. I also chose to focus on them because some of these things do trigger HIPAA. So I was kind of curious at why there weren't any federal laws, and there are to an extent, and there's some guidance. But again, the guidance is very subjective, just like 36 states that don't presume harm when a breach occurs. And so I kind of found that all to be a huge problem that really wasn't being addressed. And there had been attempts. Senator Whitehouse and Senator Graham made an attempt to close a loophole in the HIPAA security rule, and it didn't go anywhere. And as far as I can tell, Congress really isn't interested in fixing this problem. And because companies aren't required to report every breach, they don't have the public outcry necessary to force them to fix this problem. We kind of live in a reactive society now where, you're only going to make change if something's brought to the public light. And as long as things stay out of the public light, you're really not going to have the change necessary. And so that's how I feel about ransomware right now.
Yep, the squeaky wheel certainly gets the grease. There was an attack on a breach of Uber's data that came out a couple months ago or about a month ago. But I remember a lot of people freaking out about that because obviously you have your credit or debit card linked to Uber, and there's a lot of people that use it. Not only that, it also has, all your ride information and things like that, sort of where you're going and what you've been doing, which a lot of people do consider to be very personal, even if it's just using Uber to, go to a restaurant or whatever. But I agree, if there's not much public outcry, then Congress probably isn't going to do a lot. And I think another sort of inherent problem with the way our system is organized is that it's going to take a long time for a bill to come out. And then by the time that bill does come out to address whatever ransomware concern, if it's not broad enough to sort of catch everything or to be interpreted broad enough, then they're just going to come up with some new kind of, loophole on their end where they can figure out a new way to hack things that doesn't violate this law or, to sort of go around it. So it's kind of the way that technology increases at such a rapid rate is kind of hard to control from a legislative standpoint.
Oh, absolutely. But so the great thing, and my proposal is not all on my own. I did a bunch of research into finding what would work, but I thought along the same lines as you at first that maybe there's some encryption that we can require because certain states do require that you encrypt this information. And so I said maybe there's some minimum level of encryption that'll stop these attacks. And very quickly I realized that if you, just like you said, if you have this minimal level of encryption, the hackers are going to quickly beat it, and you're going to be forced to create the whole legislation all over again. And that's actually when I stumbled on this testimony from, who was it? So it's this guy named Richard Schaefer, who was the Information Assurance Director at the NSA. And in 2009, he testified in front of the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Terrorism, Technology, and Homeland Security. So this is, still when ransomware is, I would say, in its infancy. I guess not according to hackers, but I would say it's still in its infancy. And he estimated that 80% of attacks could have been prevented if we simply adhere to security measures already in place. And this kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier, when you and me might be able to spot a suspicious email a lot better than other people would. But one of the biggest problems with ransomware is that it starts when Bob at the front desk opens his email and clicks the FedEx link, or Sally opens the email saying, "Congrats, you just won $1,000." And those could all be prevented. So once they open that link, if they work for a place like Anthem, or if they work for a place like Sony, there's a possibility that getting into their computer will then allow the hackers to access every other drive on that network. And so it could all be stopped if you just convince Bob or Sally not to open that link. So what I thought was, instead of requiring a baseline of encryption, even more so than adjusting what the words are that require a notification to consumers, is we need to mandate training. Training is going to be the biggest thing that actually solves this problem. And I compared it to working in a restaurant. I worked in a restaurant in undergrad, and as anyone who works in a kitchen knows, you have to get a certificate. It's like a food safety certificate, something like that. And it requires you to do, a couple hours online, print out your certificate, and you're good to go. Well, obviously, I think we need to require more than that, but I do think that you can, if we impose certain training measures for any company that handles, so it's called electronically protected health information. EFI is what I was really focused on here. Any company that handles EFI needs to require training from everyone who works at the front desk to everyone who works in, PR, to basically anyone who accesses a computer at that company or corporation needs to have training to spot these attacks. And I think we can get rid of a lot of them if we just do that bare minimum. And that's something you can require, that you wouldn't need to change the legislation every few years to keep combating how the hackers have evolved. And eventually they will evolve to the point so that there's these things called drive-by ransomware, which is ransomware that doesn't require any user initiation before it actually gets on your computer. So obviously you're not going to stop all attacks, but you will stop a large majority of these attacks purely by fixing human error. Just by convincing humans not to touch links that they shouldn't, not to click on things saying you won $1,000 because you didn't actually win $1,000. So computer awareness, I think, is huge in combating this problem. And in terms of the legal aspect, we're actually already fine on the legal aspect. We have the Computer Frauds and Abuse Act, which is incredibly broad and makes it a felony for any person who uses a website in a way that the owner doesn't intend it to be used for. And so it pretty much any terms of hacking or ransomware is covered under that statute. Now, a few states like Wyoming and California, and I think Maryland proposed something in 2017. They've all gone a step farther. And they specifically say ransomware is a crime, and this is how it's punishable. And they make the punishments a little more extreme than what's under the Computer Frauds and Abuse Act. But the problem with that is none of these hackers are in the United States to begin with. So it's very unlikely that we're going to get to them, or at least a small minority of them are in the United States.
Where are they located primarily?
Oddly enough, and it's hard to tell, but in my research, mainly the Eastern Bloc of Europe, which I have a few theories on. I don't know exactly why they seem to all live there, but I think part of it definitely has to do with what opportunities they have growing up, how many jobs are available to make a decent wage doing something legal or ethical. And I think you would find that there's not as many. And granted, I haven't gone too far into this, so if I'm generalizing at all, I apologize to the people I'm generalizing. But the countries that these seem to come from are, Russia, Ukraine, Yugoslavia, some obviously from North Korea, but that would all be state-sponsored. They come from companies where the opportunities aren't nearly like they are in England or the United States or Canada. And so I think that when someone, at least this is my theory, that when someone displays a level of technological proficiency, people in those countries may, at least some of them, may choose to use that to further some illegal or unethical goals. Whereas in the United States, if you're a computer whiz, you can get a scholarship to MIT and you go on and you work for the NSA. That's just my theory, but that's where I generally found that most of these attacks occurred in, was the Eastern Bloc of Europe.
I don't think it's a bad theory, because you're also very alienated from the people you're affecting whenever, even if you live in the same country. It's hard to sort of see the emotional, impact it would have on, Sally that opens up this email and the entire office is infected. She could lose her job, or, this company could be, forced to pay this ransom or to put a bunch of money into, buying new servers or, what have you. So it's very easy to be alienated from whatever you're doing and not worried about the people that you're sort of affecting. And if it's out of necessity too, it's something that would be easily justified by the people in these countries.
Oh, absolutely. And I think maybe to start it might be out of necessity, but then I mean, what other profession can you join? Say you got a group of, I don't know how large these groups are, 10 hackers, and with the what was the crypto ransomware, or the crypto locker, excuse me, the crypto locker virus that gained $30 million in its first 3 months. It's a huge amount of money that, unless you're a professional athlete, you're not going to come anywhere near making that in your entire life, much less in 3 months. And so I think, at least in part, it's they're in it for the money, and why not? It's very hard to turn that kind of money down, especially when, like you said, you don't see the human effects of this. You don't see who you're impacting. And the problem is, no one really sees who's impacted by this, because unless you're a victim of identity theft and it's been made aware to you, you really have no idea what's going on. And it's kind of sad, because we don't put as much emphasis on it. We don't talk about it on the news as much as we should, but it's a very real thing. And I think if you talk to people who are victims of identity theft, it's a very invasive attack, and it takes a long time to rectify your situation, and it can end up in some very, very sad stories. They're just, it's easier for the news to talk about politics or gun violence or whatever you want to talk about than identity theft. It's not as sexy. So just my 2 cents.
Yeah, and my theory on that is that the media companies might be worried about getting hacked themselves, and if they're bringing up and exposing these, whatever network of hackers it is, they're kind of putting themselves in the crosshairs, so to speak. But it's just kind of amazing how many people out there are just smart enough to be able to do this. Like, I'm pretty good with a computer, but I wouldn't even know where to start if I was trying to hack somebody, let alone trying to hack someone's information and put it in a ransom locker and, say you have to pay me $30 million or you're never getting this information again. And it's kind of sad, really, when you think about it in this context that we have yet to prove. But there's a lot of people that may not have any other opportunities, and this is the only way they can kind of hone that craft and really define those skills with technology, is by hacking other people and sort of screwing their lives up.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and like you said, I mean, these are incredibly sophisticated attacks in most respects. And so I find it very hard. I'd like to know how these people get started, because they don't just sign onto the computer one day and figure out, hey, I can send this email to a million people and make $50,000 off of it, because 1,000 people decided to respond to me. Um, and so I gotta believe that and I think there's evidence to support this, that there's hacker collectives, and how do they recruit? I think that would be a really interesting topic. Is, where do they look for these people? Are they family members that they recruit? Are they friends? Are they are these internet chat rooms somewhere that they're just hacker grounds for recruiting? I don't know. Um, but yeah, I think once we begin to know more about these hackers, their stories will be incredibly interesting. As much as we might despise them when they're unmasked, I do think that it's worth listening to their stories, because I think they're going to be really interesting.
Yeah, I'm sure it's like you were saying with the collective stuff. There's probably a fair number of people that are sort of, especially in these third world countries or wherever, that are hiring, the neighbor kids or whatever to learn how to do these things, and then sort of building up their network from there, where they're at the top and can kind of control what fish they're going to go after, and then these are the people that are doing the coding and everything along with it. It's really mind blowing though, like just the amount of knowledge that people accrue for the wrong reasons. It just makes you wonder what they could do if they lived in a place with more opportunity and were able to, like you said, work for the NSA or work for Google or something like that. Like, what could those people create instead of just tearing it down?
Oh, absolutely. It's amazing how much time and effort goes into ruining society, as opposed to actually helping it, and where we might be if all of this power was focused on good. But that's a little too altruistic. I mean, there's always going to be evil. There's always going to be people doing stuff because the money's there. I think that even in the United States, the government struggles to recruit the best and the brightest, because the money simply isn't there. Whereas private industries that are more focused on making money provide much better salaries. And so I think we lose a lot of people, other than those who just want to do good in the world, and who will go work for the government purely because this is, they believe that their use is can help mankind, for lack of a better word. But yeah, I think it's very interesting on how these people get involved, why they get involved, and I don't like to dwell too much on what would happen if they didn't get involved because I think that's too much of a pipe dream. I think for now we just have to figure out who are they recruiting, why are they doing this, and how do we eventually stop them? I don't think you'll ever actually stop them, but
So when you were in your research, did you ever get into anything about people hacking car technology? Because I remember back in like 2014 or 13, I think there was the Chrysler models and the Jeep specifically. People were hacking those through Sprint cell towers and were able to control everything from the speed that the person's going. They could shift gears in the car, putting it in park to drive, brakes, volume on the radio, air conditioning, all that stuff was connected through this Uconnect interface. And I know they've since stubbed that out, but it made me think of this because I was reading a report earlier, and Elon Musk was talking about how he predicts that self-driving cars will be, it was either like 200% or 100% safer than human-driven cars by the end of next year. And with cars becoming more, um, self-driving, like Cadillac just came out with that new technology where it's like, I think they called it like advanced cruise control, where they can control the speed as well as steering on the highways and things like that. So you can imagine where there'd be a lot of problems if you're driving down the road and all of a sudden on your touchscreen somebody pops up and says, "I'm controlling your vehicle, wire me this," or whatever, or "I'm gonna disable your brakes and whatnot." So did you uncover anything like that, or any sort of any more examples like of individuals being affected by this?
no, nothing like that. Although I'm sure it's out there. I'm positive the technology's out there if it hasn't been used already. I think again that kind of goes back to the pacemaker problem where unless hackers, the benefit of attacking a company or a corporation is you have millions of users' personal information already stored in one place. If you're going to attack a car, hack a car, then you're going to spend a lot of time and effort getting into one specific vehicle that the person may or may not pay you the ransom from. So unless, and back to our early examples, unless you're Dick Cheney or you're Bill Gates, I don't know how much success users are going to have on that because if they do try to do something large scale, imagine if every Chevy Equinox or whatever it's called from 2017 shuts down in a single day. You're gonna have a massive public outcry. And again, this just goes back to that if we want to fix a problem, you need the public to stand up. And so that's the only way that I could see hackers making that profitable, either by targeting one or two individuals who are worth a lot of money or by targeting a lot of individuals. But if you target a lot of individuals in that way, you're going to get a response from the government. It's going to be quick. It's going to be swift. If it's, if you trace it back to North Korea, you're going to slap more sanctions on them. If you trace it back to a hacker collective in Russia or Romania, wherever it is, then again, you'll have a response from the United States that will probably take care of the problem. Um, but no, I find it very interesting because the world is easier when everything's online. The world is easier when we hook everything up to our internet. I would love to have a smart house. I think that would be awesome. So instead of shying away from that stuff, we just need to figure out how to make it safer to use. I don't think we can. I think we've gone too far. I don't think we can shy away from it now. Ideally, we'd all live in log cabins and write each other letters and
That
everything.
would suck.
I'd actually love it. I'd love it. But that's just not feasible anymore. Everything's hooked up to the internet wherever you go. So, but specifically about your Elon Musk 200% safer thing, so I find self-driving cars incredibly interesting. I haven't done a whole lot of research. I know one of the main concerns is in the cities, bicyclists. I guess cars in San Francisco during test drives have struggled to identify bikers as easily as other cars or other people just walking along. I don't know the exact reasons, but they're going to have to fix that. And two, and this is just more the legal aspect of it, is do you get a DUI if you're pulled over using your self-driving car? And I think you do. I think under the laws today, you do. I think it's, if you fall asleep in the back of your car, you can get a DUI because you're in semi-control over the vehicle. You can, as courts will say, you could get up at any moment and choose to operate that vehicle. And therefore, even though you're not driving when you were stopped, or even though you're not driving when the cop knocked on your back window to wake you up, you're going to get arrested and convicted for that DUI. Now, as far as I know, most of these self-driving cars now still have a steering wheel. And I think that's your biggest problem. Until we take out the steering wheel, which means you trust 100% wherever you are on the road that this self-driving car is going to take you from point A to point B and handle everything in between. But until we take out that steering wheel, one of the biggest, at least in my mind, one of the biggest benefits to self-driving cars, which is a great reduction in DUIs, which means a great reduction in fatalities on the road every year. You're going to find a lot of people who are shocked that they're being arrested and taken into custody for taking their self-driving car on the way home from a bar. You're gonna hear some really funny stories about it in a few years when they finally have it implemented, or if, according to Elon Musk, in 2 years, whenever it is. But yeah, I think that'll be really interesting, and I could see some really interesting commentaries coming out about how do we address self-driving cars and driving under the influence.
I think another interesting topic going along with that is it Waymo, or what's the company with a W that's making the self-driving cars? I think it's Waymo or Waze, or it's not Waze, but I think it's might be Waymo. Anyway, they're making the self-driving 18-wheelers, and they're testing them in Arizona this week, I believe. And so I think it's interesting because those are so heavily regulated in terms of how many hours a trucker can drive, how many miles they can drive. Because I know, like, at a certain point, because I used to work at a casino when I was an undergrad, and then I was in the transportation department, so I was a valet, and I would also have to pick people up from hotels and stuff like that every now and then because they had like a shuttle type service. So, needless to say, you met some really interesting people. And there was this one guy who was a truck driver, and he was telling me that after a certain number of miles, that his truck will only let him go. I think it was like 30 miles an hour or something like that. So basically, just far enough to like be able to putt around the parking lot, or and there was a mile range on it too. It was like 5 or 6 miles. So like far enough to like putt around the parking lot to find a place to sleep, or to maybe get fuel or something along those lines. So I'm curious, if you have these people that are in these trucks, they don't have to drive anymore. If these trucks are driving themselves, do they still have a limit? Is there still like a point where, if they need to operate it and they've been on the road for 14 hours, do they, are they in some violation of their code, or their codes that they have? Do they amend them and put more trust in the self-driving trucks? It's just a really interesting area. And the problem you were mentioning with the bicyclist just really gets amplified when you have someone driving an 18-wheeler as opposed to a Honda Accord or something like that.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I think eventually you just won't have truck drivers. I think that'll be, eventually you have people at point A who load the truck and people at point B who don't load the truck. I wonder how many truck drivers in the United States. Crazy how many jobs we're going to lose to robots, but that's one area I hadn't.
But it's going to be huge. It's probably way bigger than you would expect.
Oh, it's going to be. I mean, so and this is getting a little far away from the conversation, but that's the reason I think that universal basic income, or UBI, is going to be a very real thing in not necessarily a short amount of time, but in the next 10 or 15 years. Congress is going to have to sit down and have a real serious discussion about universal basic income, because you're going to get to the point where there's, you take away factory workers, you take away truck drivers, you take away pretty much any manual labor job. Eventually, you take away anyone who works at a fast food restaurant. These are all going to be replaced by robots eventually. And then you're starting to talk about 20% unemployment, 25% unemployment, 30% unemployment. And I think 30% is absolutely reasonable. I think it'll eventually get higher than that. But now you're talking about a quarter to a third of the population that's out of work, part of the working population that's out of work. And you're going to have some serious issues. I mean, what was the high during the recession? Was it like 9-10%? And then it was, I mean, you had some serious issues as a result of that. So imagine double that. It's going to be that you have to have universal basic income, or you'll have people dying on the streets. And that's just a bad look for anyone involved, and also a tragedy. So yeah, I think we're eventually going to have the universal basic income talk, and I'm kind of excited for it. I think it can be a very interesting idea depending on how they roll it out.
So how does universal basic income sort of work? I'm not too familiar with it. I'm generally very against anything that's not like a complete free market. But do you mean does it raise like a minimum wage, or is there like sort of a set limit in terms of what people are making? How does the basic function of it?
So there's a few different ways it can work, but just most generally, the universal basic income is it's free money, if you will. Obviously, nothing's free, but it's
Starting to scare me a little bit, Tom.
I don't mean to. It's like a stipend. So and it's worked in a couple of ways. The way that I would like to see it explored is that it applies to everyone, regardless of what your income is now. So, say the government gives you $1,500 a month, and that covers living expenses, that covers rent, food, whatever it is. That's your base. And some companies have tried to do it. Okay, we're only going to give universal basic income to people who are unemployed, and it's actually saved them money because it's improved the quality of life so much that they get to. And this is just, people are going to get mad and say, that crap, it doesn't actually save money. Well, there's statistics that say that in some cases it does save money. Um, and it's basically just to allow people to live a normal life without the fears of, I'm going to get my house taken away, I'm not going to have enough food to eat. And it's really only going to become a necessity when we have these very high unemployment rates because robots are taking all of our jobs. But the thing that fascinates me the most about universal basic income is when you don't tie it to somebody's income. So, say let's use Sally again. So Sally loses her job. She's a long road trucker. She loses her job, and so she's given universal basic income. And this is two ways of thought. So say you give it only to people who make less than $30,000 a year. Well, Sally is going to be trying to start up an Etsy shop, and she gets pretty good at it. And she makes $31,000 a year, and she loses her universal basic income. What motivates Sally to create that Etsy shop? Nothing, because if she loses her safety net and her Etsy shop fails, she's back to square one, and now she has to try to get that money back from the government to continue her life. However, if you don't tie it to income, you're going to have people like Sally and like Bob and like you and me who take the money, use it to spend on their home and their food and their kids and yada, yada, yada. But then also go and create that Etsy shop, knowing that it might fail, but not being worried that they won't have food on the table if it does fail. And I think then you're going to have some truly great inventions. I think allowing people the basic necessities in life, which you're eventually going to have to do because robots are going to take almost all jobs, even lawyers, believe it or not. But by allowing these people to still get that check, even if they make more than, whatever the $30,000 is, you're encouraging innovation. And sure, some people will be lazy and some people won't want to create anything at all. They'll simply sit there and collect their $1,500 a month and be happy doing it. But I think you'll find a lot of people that when you take away that fear of falling below the safety net, of not having money to put on the table, I think you're going to find that a lot of people just want to create things, whether that's art, whether that's a shop. I've compared it to a second renaissance before, and I truly I think that we would experience something of a second renaissance if you don't make universal basic income dependent on what you make already. And I think you find that the studies, so there's one out of Norway, there's one out of Canada, and I think you'll find a couple other countries. But I do think you'll find that the studies back this up, that overall that depression goes down, that anxiety goes down, that life enjoyment goes way up. And I think that's what you need for a better society. And so the question all becomes is, how do we pay for this? Well, and this I truly have done no research on. So again, don't get mad at me, listeners. My idea is tax robots. You tax the hell out of robots. The employers are still going to be making more money than they were if they had to pay for an employee who has health insurance and yada, yada, yada. They're going to be much more efficient because robots are more efficient than employees. So those employers are going to be making more money. And so I don't think it's inconceivable to levy a fairly extreme tax to the point where the employer is still making more money having those robots, but then also using that tax to then give back to the people who are out of work, to start who are out of work, and eventually to everyone. And I think eventually you will see that over time you save money, because a lot of the problems our society has, mainly with depression. I mean, how much money does America spend on depression and anxiety every year? I guarantee you the number's just outrageous. And not even talking about, going to see a doctor, but talking about your loss of work, what your loss of production. There's very interesting statistics that when someone isn't being productive, if something major on the news happens, how much money does the U.S. lose during that hour because everyone turns away from their work computer and starts focusing on that? And the number's outrageous. So I do think you will find that over time it's either a wash or we end up saving money on it. But regardless of whether we save money on it, we're going to have to, or else you're going to have 30% of the population who's unemployed and has nothing better to do then get their pitchforks and go find the person who made them unemployed. And that's either their employer if they blame their employer, or that's the government if they blame the government for allowing companies to replace all of these workers with robots. So, regardless of whether we gain money, whether we lose money, whether it's a wash, whether you agree with it, whether you don't agree with it, it's a necessity. And 10 to 15 years from now, it's going to dominate the conversation if it doesn't do so well before then.
Yeah, I agree with most parts of it. The only thing I don't like is the taxing the corporations heavily, because I just think it's dumb policy to tax someone who's gone the extra mile to make a company and to employ these robots, because it goes back to the same conversation we have now, that because realistically speaking, if you make like 140,000, or what is it, like 240,000, you essentially make the same because you get taxed at such a higher bracket, which is fucking bullshit, because it diminishes the incentive to work harder, and it just takes from the rich and quote unquote gives to the poor. So the only concern I would have is that if you're getting taxed at such a high rate, why even go through the struggle to get these robots? Or if you're getting taxed at such a high rate, what if I just don't ever maintain them? What if they need upgrades in the firmware and it's too expensive and I don't want to do it? Then you might have UPS trucks that are robotic that take longer to get things from point A to point B, because I'm already having to shell this money out for taxes and I'm not making much more of a profit. I'm probably not going to upgrade these because that was my idea when I bought these. I bought these because I wouldn't need to upgrade them and I wouldn't have HR issues and things like that you would with human beings. But I could see your point if you had it where it wasn't tied to income base and you have that sort of safety net. The only thing that I would be a little skeptical of, though, is the decreasing depression, because I know that when we make more money, we become more depressed. And it's not so much the money that makes us happy, but it's the purpose in making the money. It's the journey, so to speak, as cliche as that sounds. But research has shown that when we don't have any sort of struggle in our life, when we have these easy things like Amazon and these suburban, houses that we live in where everything's close together and safe, that depression actually increases because we don't have anything that makes us work harder. We don't have any satisfaction when we're able to get these things because the money's just being handed to us. So that would be my big concern. But that's not obviously, but it could be considered an ancillary to the problem of the unemployment rate skyrocketing. So I do understand your point there, but my only concern would be that my two concerns would be that if you're taxing the corporations too much, then it's going to disincentivize them to upgrade or just transfer to the system, and that it might increase depression in a lot of people because they no longer have any purpose to go out and make money. They don't have any fire under their feet.
Yeah, so absolutely. So the tax, and again, the tax on robots just been an idea that I've kind of floated around. I've never done any serious research into it, but I do believe that any tax you levy against corporations would have to be so that the robots are still more profitable than the humans. They have to still have this incentive for, like you said, going out there and getting this technology, because I mean, obviously they're going to make more money because robots are more productive than humans, but you also then have to make sure that those robots aren't costing more than humans. So when you'd have to factor into everything. You'd have to factor into the cost of having them built, the cost of having them maintained, and yada yada yada. You got to factor all of that in, and then you have to make sure that the tax you're levying against them is still a significant amount less than the tax it costs them to do this. And to your second point, so obviously you're not going to cure depression just by giving people money. It's never going to happen. But what you are going to do is you're going to take the depression that stems from a fear of not having basic human necessities, and you're going to get rid of that. And that's what the study specifically in Canada showed, that it was the fear of not having a house. It was the fear of not having food on the table that really caused the depression in the group that they used. And they found it had a great success. And then hopefully to combat, and I think the other form of depression you talk about is, these people who they feel like they have no purpose in life. And that's why I would suggest that we don't make UBI dependent on your wage, because I think as long as you have that safety net underneath you, I think allowing someone to branch out and try to discover that purpose in life would make people happier, generally speaking. So for instance, let's say they replace my job with a robot and the government starts sending me $1,500 a month. What would I do first? I'd design a video game. I'd get the equipment. I'd probably have to spend it out over time, but I would eventually get the equipment, and I would dedicate my 8 hours a day to building a video game. And maybe it eventually takes off, and I'm selling it for $5 on Steam Marketplace or something like that. Then, as I talked about before, my concern would be that if I felt that that game was going to make me $31,000 a year, I would never design it because I would be risking everything just on this game making me $31,000 a year. Where if I had a bad year, it only makes me $25,000. Well, now I'm losing money because now they're not paying me UBI anymore because I made this game because I already have a wage. And so if you don't make it wage dependent, then you allow people to go out there and find their purpose in life. I'm sure look at all the people who out there who think that they're great singers. Most of them are not. But allow those people to, buy some recording equipment with this money, and that's their purpose in life. And then maybe you have people who feel like they're truly trying to fulfill their goals. And I think you would eventually combat depression that way too. Obviously, you're never going to combat all depression, but I think allowing people this opportunity would help in some respects.
Yeah, I could see that. I think I would just have to see some more of the numbers and stuff about maybe where the money would be coming from before I could get fully on board, but I could definitely see some benefits of it. Another thing that I wanted to mention that was sort of in tech news that I thought was pretty interesting was this case with Microsoft that the Supreme Court just heard. I don't know if you know anything about that or have looked into it, but the central issue was that Microsoft got served a warrant. It was a Section 2703 warrant, which is under the Communications or the Stored Communications Act. And what the Stored Communications Act does is addresses voluntary and compelled disclosure of stored wire and electronic communications and transactional records from internet service providers. This was enacted in 1986, so obviously there's some issues there with them not really knowing that a cloud would exist and so on. But anyway, they were trying to get a particular individual's email information from Microsoft, and they were claiming that they wouldn't give them the specific emails, sort of the sent back and forth emails, because they were stored on a server in Ireland. And obviously, Microsoft is a US-based company, so the argument was they're easily accessible. They should give them over, and Microsoft is claiming that they're not going to because the data essentially lives somewhere else. So I think that introduces a whole really interesting area of stuff with the Fourth Amendment and sort of where we're going with tech. If you're able to sort of move things around and put them in different countries, which realistically wouldn't be that hard or isn't that hard, especially for a company like Microsoft. It makes you wonder, how much could people really be hiding behind the scenes or, putting just outside of the government's grasp.
Yeah, so I don't know a whole lot about the case, but I can tell you a few things. I know that the statute you referenced was, I can say with a fair amount of certainty, is that it was written to be incredibly broad so that it could be adapted to things like the cloud, even though they didn't know the cloud existed back then, or the cloud didn't exist back then. They weren't sure that it was ever going to exist. But I can assure you that the government will find a way to make sure that statute is applicable to the cloud. But just my initial thoughts is that Microsoft is going to lose, and mainly because A, like you said, they're a U.S.-based company, but B, I'd have to believe whoever's email they're going after, did that ever hit a tower in the United States? Does that, get into kind of legal terms now, and I might not be using that correctly, but I think this is probably an issue that touches and concerns the United States to a sufficient extent that the Supreme Court will say, yeah, you can have access to those. And I also think that if the Supreme Court denied access to those, they'd be opening the door for companies to do this whenever they wanted, for whatever information they wanted. And I think that would be an alarming precedent to set. The Supreme Court really likes to, I'm assuming the government's after these?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah. The Supreme Court likes to give the government a lot of latitude, especially when national security is involved. And so if the government's trying really hard to get this guy's emails, I suspect that the Supreme Court will let him. And granted, I don't know a lot about the case, so that's just speculation. But yeah, I have to believe that Microsoft's not going to be able to get away from it just by hiding it overseas. I feel like it's an alarming precedent to set.
Yeah, I agree. And we'll see what comes out of this because as far as I know, they haven't released their decision yet, and this case was heard at the end of February. But another current event, which I know you do know a good deal about, is this new Florida gun law. If you're listening to these episodes in chronological order, the last episode was about gun laws, and at the time we recorded it, we weren't aware of this new Florida law. But essentially, Governor Rick Scott of Florida signed into law a number of different gun laws, and one of which raises the minimum age to purchase a gun to 21, and adds a waiting period of 3 days for purchasing a firearm. So how do you think, because I can almost guarantee somebody's going to bring a claim against Florida for this or against the governor for this. How do you think that the court would rule on this particular issue?
Yes, someone has brought a claim. The NRA already sued him. They sued him
Oh,
within,
did they really?
Yeah, they sued him within minutes of the bill being signed. So I think it's blatantly unconstitutional. I don't think it stands a chance. If I'm going to be a conspiracy theorist, I'm going to say Rick Scott and the 67 Republicans who voted for it, who all had A ratings from the NRA, knew that it didn't stand a chance. But so I figured we might talk about this. So I brushed up on my Second Amendment law a little bit before I came. And the most recent case is this case out of California called Peruta v. County of San Diego. It's from the Ninth Circuit. It was recently denied cert by the Supreme Court, basically upholding the lower court's ruling. But the Ninth Circuit does a really good analysis of the history surrounding the Second Amendment. That's what you really got to look at for these types of cases, is what was the intent of the founders at the time. And so the Supreme Court in United States versus Heller, which was, I don't know, mid-2000s, when Scalia was still alive, did the same analysis, and they looked at the intent of the founders. And I know if you read the Second Amendment, a lot of people will say, well, it's just to establish a well-regulated militia. Well, not exactly, no. One of the main intents of the Second Amendment was to be allowed to protect your homestead. And that was a huge thrust, was that people need firearms not just in case the government they need to rise up against the government, but first and foremost because you need to be able to defend yourself. And there was a lot of support for that in the common law. And so in Peruta, they discussed concealed carry. Basically, San Diego said you need good cause before you can get a concealed carry permit. And the good cause was incredibly hard to prove. And it was all up to the sheriff. And it was a little out there. But anyways, so the court does this really detailed analysis of, okay, were you ever allowed to use concealed carry? Were you ever allowed to have concealed weapons in, the 13th century? No, you weren't. What about the 14th century? No, you weren't. 15th century, 16th century, 17th century, yada, yada, yada. No, you never were. And so then they went to the colonial America, which basically, again, you couldn't have concealed carry weapons outside of your home. You couldn't bring a weapon outside your home. And there was a law from New Jersey and there was another law from Massachusetts. So they went even further. After the Second Amendment was enacted, were there any laws that allowed you to bring a concealed carry permit outside of your home, or concealed weapon outside of your home? There's actually one state, Kentucky, said, yeah, you can bring a weapon outside of your home. And Kentucky actually cited its own Constitution to do this. But interestingly enough, shortly after that case, the Kentucky legislature amended their constitution to reverse that decision. So in the context of concealed carry, the court in the Ninth Circuit in Peruta said, hey, from the common law all the way up through after the Second Amendment was enacted, and even 100 years past that, we never allowed concealed carry because that wasn't the thrust of the Second. The thrust of the Second was about protecting your home, and they make this very clear in their opinion. And in Heller, Scalia made this very clear as well. Heller concerned a similar thing, but it was an overall firearm ban, handgun ban in the District of Columbia. And Scalia, just like the Ninth Circuit in Peruta, said no, the main thrust of the Second is to protect your home. So now this leads us to the new Florida law, which raises the age of owning a firearm. And it's just owning a firearm. It's not possessing a firearm. So that is one distinction. But owning a firearm from 18 to 21. And if I was the court, I would look at it. So if whenever a law is being challenged as unconstitutional or depriving you of your constitutional rights, you have to look at, the court will look at whether there is a compelling governmental interest to deprive someone of that right, and whether it is narrowly tailored to achieve that further that compelling government. And I think the problem you run in with this law is that it's not narrowly tailored. I think for the purpose of the Constitution, and basically, it's arbitrary, but we've decided that 18 is the age of adulthood. Sign up for the military when you're 18, you can vote when you're 18, you have to be 21 to drink, and you can be 16 to drive, but for most of it, it's 18. And I think a lot of people will agree that 18 is also supposed to be the age that you're supposed to move out of your parents' house. Now, that's changed with millennials. I get that. We're all living with our parents till we're 25. But regardless, there are a lot of people who move out of their house when they're 18. And this is why I think it's unconstitutional. Because even if it's, 10, 20% of 18-year-olds live on their own, those people do not have the ability to protect their homes under this new law. And I think that the analysis in Peruta and the analysis in Heller, and even in United States versus McDonald, which is another Supreme Court case on the similar topic, if you go by that analysis, if you go by that precedent, and the main thrust of the Second Amendment is protecting your home, then those 20% of people who were 18 and moved out have no ability to protect their home. And I think you're gonna have a major concern. I personally think the district court's gonna laugh them out of court. I think the appellate court will. I think the appellate court will agree with them, and I think the Supreme Court will deny cert. And if I'm being a conspiracy theorist, I think that Governor Rick Scott and the 67 Republicans knew this would likely be unconstitutional. Obviously, we live in a very heated political debate right now after the shootings in Stoneman Douglas, and there's too many schools. We can all agree on that. And there's a lot of political pressure on people right now to do something to change the gun laws. And again, this is my conspiracy theory hat. I think that part of Rick Scott, who is an NRA member and also graduated from law school, I think he knew that this would be a way. He's also running for senator in 2018. But I think this would be a way for him to be able to point to the people and say, hey, I tried to do something. I tried to raise this to 21. While at the same time drafting legislation that to a lawyer should seem unconstitutional, and I think the NRA is going to win. So I think they have the best of both worlds now, as they get to point to their constituents and say, hey, we did something. The court overturned us, but we did the best we could. And the NRA has no reason to be mad at these people now, even though the NRA doesn't like the legislation, because the NRA is going to get a victory for their members once this is overturned. So I think the entire Florida law was just kind of a political move more than anything. I don't think it stands any chance in court, and I think we should be skeptical. For the people who want gun change, they should be skeptical, and for the people who don't want gun change, know that it's very hard to get around the Second Amendment, and courts generally uphold past precedent. And we've had a number of decisions that say, while certain guns are not necessarily protected by the Second Amendment, you'll always have the ability to carry some sort of weapon in your home to defend your home.
That was a very thorough analysis. I appreciate it. And I think it'll be really interesting because I think everyone's going to lose their mind if this gets overturned. And, like your analysis is correct, which I believe it will be. But it's still crazy because nothing like that really happens in modern context where, laws like this are overturned, especially something like this in the media and this politically charged and whatnot. But as far as the topics for today, I think that's about all I have to cover. Did you have anything else you wanted to go over?
No, absolutely. I think we went over the time a little bit, but I've enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate you having me on.
That's no problem. I appreciate you coming.
Hey, maybe you'll have me back and we'll talk about UBI once I do a little more research on it. It should be an interesting legal conversation.
Yeah, sure. I'd be interested in having that. Just let me know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I appreciate you having me on, and take it easy.
Thank you for listening to How Is This Legal? If you enjoyed the show, help others find us by clicking the subscribe button, leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcast, and sharing this podcast with your family and friends. Come back next time to find out how is this legal?